Let's talk about the mess of the three popes of one time. That's one of the big criticisms that people will label it against the church here and there. And, oh, well, you guys can't even get your acts straight. You had three popes at one time. I mean,
Right.
how could you say that you had popes if you had all these popes fighting for the papacy? And I mean, were there actually three popes at one time? What was the deal with that?
Yeah, so to give the historical context and background to that, right? So this is the beginning of the 14th century. So you have the 14th century is really one of the most critical centuries in the life or in the history of the church. But many people don't know
Mhm.
what went on in the 14th century or the major events that happened during it. But this is to give some context, right? This is the period of time when the Hundred Years' War between England and France begins. It's a time, so it's a time of violence between major areas of Europe. It's a time of the Great Black Death, the Great Plague that comes along midway through that century as well. There were famines even before that. There was, political unrest and difficulty throughout major areas of Christendom, and so it's a time of great turmoil. And one of the major areas of turmoil was in the papacy. One of the major crises of that century was dealing with the papacy, and the initial one was the papacy moving its residence, the popes moving their home, if you will, from Rome to France, to the south of France, to the town of Avignon. Now, Avignon technically at the time was papal territory. It wasn't French royal territory. It wasn't beholden to the French king, but it is in now what is the modern day state of France, modern day France. And the popes do that for a number of reasons. There's political problems and issues with some of the Italian families in Rome. Rome was not a very safe place to be. There was a lot of corruption, a lot of political instability. The French Pope, a man who was elected in the early part of the 14th century, Clement V, decides, and I'm not going to go to Rome. I want to stay in France. So he goes to the south of France. It was meant to be a temporary measure, but it ultimately ended up being a permanent place, if you will, for the popes for 70 years. So if you can think about the scandal of that, right? I mean, you could, as a Catholic living at that time, be born and raised and died and never know that the Pope of, the Bishop of Rome is actually ever living in the city of his diocese, right? That's the ecclesiastical abuse in history known as absenteeism, when a bishop doesn't live in the diocese in which he's the bishop. Still the Bishop of Rome, but just not living there, right? He's not the Bishop of Avignon. There's a separate man who is the Bishop of Avignon. So anyway, so this is the Pope papacy moves there, is there for 70 years. Eventually the papacy comes back to Rome. The Pope moves back. Gregory the 11th is urged, especially by St. Catherine of Siena, to finally come home. He does. He moves the papal residence back to Rome. But soon after he arrives there in 1378, he dies. And then there's a new Pope that's elected. And obviously, the Roman people are very happy that the Pope had come back after 70 years. They don't want to see the Pope go back to France. So obviously, they want the cardinals, who at this point are overwhelming. There's not many of them, frankly, there's only 16, but many of them or overwhelmingly are French. So there's a good chance that people are assuming that they're going to elect a Frenchman and he might move the papacy back. So they clamor and want and make it known, quite loudly that they want an Italian to be elected. And so the cardinals who were present, agree with that, and they elect an Italian who becomes Urban VI. And Urban VI obviously stays in Rome, and he's a reform-minded man, a reform-minded pope, but he gets a little heavy-handed with how he tries to initiate his reform in his dealing with the cardinals. And so many of the cardinals then, a couple of months after Urban VI's election, decide that, well, we were kind of forced by the Roman populace to elect this Italian, and he's not treating us well, and we don't. So we're going to say that we were forced into electing him, and we're going to declare him not to be the Pope, and we're going to elect a new man to be Pope. And so they elect a Frenchman who takes the name Clement VII, and he is an anti-Pope. Right. So these cardinals had no authority to do that. Once you elect a pope, the man is pope, and he accepts the man is pope until he dies or he abdicates.
Whether you like him or not.
Whether you like him or not, right? That is the Pope. And so, Urban VI did neither. He wasn't dead, and he hadn't abdicated the throne either. So he was legitimately elected in the valid Pope. Cardinals claimed otherwise. They elected another man to be Pope. He is technically an anti-Pope. Again, not the first time in church history we've had anti-Popes. The very first one was back in the 3rd century. There's been anti-Popes throughout the church's life. Sometimes, there were anti-Popes for successive papacies. And many times there haven't been. But so not the first time, but why this makes this problematic is that many of the major powers, secular authorities and rulers in Europe now begin to side with one man's claim over the other. right? Many secular rulers had become very annoyed with the papacy for being in France for 70 years. Many other non-French secular rulers believed that the Pope was nothing but a puppet of the French king and always doing the French king's bidding. That's not exactly true, and that's not what really happened during the Avignon papacy, but that's the impression and the perception that many of these other non-French secular rulers had. So they're upset, they're angry, they start to back other people, right? So there's some that line up for Urban VI, there's some that line up for Clement VII, the anti-pope, and so it's a major mess, right? Eventually, Clement VII dies, and when the anti-pope dies, that's an opportunity for this schism, it's called the Great Western Schism in history, to end by a new anti-pope not being elected, if you will. But that doesn't happen. These kind of renegade cardinals and this kind of anti-cardinalate, if you will, or anti-conclave meets and elects a man to succeed Clement VII. Eventually, Urban VI dies, and then a validly elected pope is elected in Rome. Because after this happens, Urban VI gets rid of the cardinals, right, and he creates a whole new group of new cardinals, and so you still have that continuity there in Rome. And so this eventually lasts for nearly 40 years. Which is a significant period of time where you have not one but two, and then eventually early in the 15th century, cardinals from both camps get together and they decide, well, we need to end this. This is a horrible scandal for the church, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so they declared at the time, both men, one in Rome and one in Avignon in France. The anti-pope had moved there to declare both of them, deposed.
Deposed. Yep.
And then elected a new pope, and they elected a new guy to be pope. So, and he lives in Pisa because this meeting happens in Pisa. So there's now at this point in the early part of the 15th century, 3 men claiming to be pope. There's not really 3 popes, and many people, inadvertently and inaccurately describe it that way. There is one man throughout this whole period of time who is the avowedly elected pope, and there are 2 anti-popes at this point. Then eventually this gets settled with the Council of Constance in the early part of the 15th century, where the legitimately elected pope at the time living in Rome, Gregory XII, sends legates to the council, where he first of all recognizes the authority of the council to meet, which is required for a council to be authoritative. It has to be papally called or papally approved. And then he abdicates in the second part of his letter, saying that he's stepping down, renouncing his claim to the throne, so that a new man can be elected that all of Christendom will recognize as pope. And that's what happens. Martin V is elected, and the Great Western Schism comes to an end. But it's obviously extremely scandalous. It happens for an entire generation.
Yeah. I mean, for a lot of people's whole life almost. And I mean, it's just insane, like how, and it's much deeper than this too. I mean, we can't even do this justice on a short little podcast, but just the depth of the political ties, the depth of the dislike of the other side and refusing to back down. And, finally the Pope says, for the good of the church, I'm going to step down. Whereas the other ones, and it didn't, I think one got jailed or something. He ended up losing favor with the political leaders.
Yeah, well, I know that they were, eventually the ones who were still around at the time of the Council of Constance, they were both deposed by the council. One who, Pedro Luna was his name, but Benedict XIII was his anti-papal name, if you will. He refused to recognize the authority of that council and continued to consider himself the legitimate pope for the rest of his life, and he just ended up dying. But yeah. And then that kind of claim, ended with his death, but yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I love how you started that with, let's start this whole thing with the proper historical backdrop, because that's what most people don't understand. How did we get here in the first place? And I think this is going to even lead, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's even going to lead into the Protestant Reformation when we start talking about that, is that the Protestant Reformation corruption, that didn't start then. It started way back when. I mean, perhaps even in this century, because of the Black Death and a lot of other political issues that the church was struggling with. I mean, in the Black Death, most people don't realize that the good priests eagerly sought to go help people, to minister to the dying, and ended up dying a lot themselves. I mean, whole hordes of bishops and priests who were great saintly priests and bishops were dead. And the ones who should never have become priests, who wanted power and money, they didn't help anybody. They saved themselves. So we're left with a lot of, almost an overabundance in some ways of like corruption in the church because of the good people who had died. And I don't think people recognize the different circumstances that played into this. And I remember I was talking to some Mormons once, And we had been talking for months. And finally, I don't know why, this particular week, I said, this is the week I'm going to turn up the heat on them because their arguments just don't hold up. So I held their feet to the fire a lot, and to their inconsistencies in their religion, the holes in their religion and such. And finally, one of the Mormons, it's almost like he had a revelation, like, he's right. And he just got so angry. He stood up and smashed the table. And he said, even if I wasn't a Mormon, I would never become a Catholic. You guys had the Crusades, you had the Inquisition, you had 3 popes at one time. You had, I said, whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay. Those are great objections. We can talk about them. Which one would you like to talk about first? And he calms himself, and he sits back down. He's like, okay. He's like, 3 popes at one time. I said, great. Who were the popes? What? What were their names? He looks at the guy next to him. He's like, I don't know. And I was like, what years did it happen? He's like, looks to the guy next to him again. He's like, I don't know. I said, what was the historical circumstances and backdrop that were happening at the time that led to this? And these two poor Mormons realized so quickly that they were passionate about something that they knew nothing about. And I feel like that's so much of our culture, is like they just throw these things out here, but it's so important to understand the historical context and circumstances that were happening.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're exactly right. And that's what I try to start off with when I try, you don't always have the time, right, to provide as much of an overview as you want, but I think it's extremely important. And that's what I do in the book is each chapter I start off with at least, a couple of pages of here's the historical background. Here's the context of what's happening, but, politically, militarily, within the church, external to the church, so that you set the stage so that people, because, historical events don't happen in a vacuum, right? They happen during the course of a world, of a society, of a particular background and context. And so we have to know that to make sense of it and to understand it, because that is one of the major modern pitfalls of history, is that we tend, or even just of modernity, that we tend to when we look at the past, and frequently many times we don't, right, or we ignore history, we try to change history, but when we look at the past, we look at history, we view it through our lens, right? We view it through the lens of modernity, through how we think. And that's the improper way in which to understand historical events and historical people, right? We have to understand why people did based on who they were, when they lived, and how they believed. Right? Not to say that not to make excuses for immoral behavior or other things that happened at the time, but to provide a greater explanation for why certain decisions were made or certain actions were performed. You can't do that by assuming that people think like you do, right? You have to understand
Right.
how a 14th century person thought, what was important to them, how did they live, how was their society structured, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah, so people, if you want to check it, if you love history and you want to know the history of the church in these areas, and you want to know some of the hot button topics that people often attack the church with, definitely check out this book, Light from Darkness. Or if you just want to understand our current problems and struggles and scandals today in the church, and you want to get a whole big context on them, definitely check out this book, Light in the Darkness.